to the Genuinely Care About You podcast. My name is Christina S. Wilcox, and I'm your host. On this podcast, we talk about everything related to mental health, creativity, faith, religious trauma, books, music, Enneagram, all of the things. And today we are actually going to be diving into a topic that I'm re-recording because basically you guys had asked me on the podcast Instagram, which is at Genuinely Care About You, to talk about early symptoms of OCD and ADHD that I now notice in hindsight were symptoms of OCD and ADHD. And for those who don't know my story or background, I was diagnosed about 3 years ago with OCD and was diagnosed with ADHD a year ago at 24. And there are a lot of things, obviously, looking back, that it makes total sense why I would have these diagnoses. But the reason why I'm re-recording the episode is because when I started to talk in detail about some of the symptoms and behavioral patterns that I had noticed in childhood, I got very upset. I had a hard time breathing. Basically, the entire podcast was me having a panic attack. And even as I talk about it now, my heart rate gets a little elevated, and I did some reflection as to why that happened. And I think it's because there is so much grief in getting a late diagnosis, especially for something like ADHD, which is a developmental disorder. And I wanted to talk about that grief today. So this episode may be a little heavier as a content warning for anyone who may not be feeling a desire to listen to some heavy and raw thoughts today. But that's what I wanted to talk about, because I do feel like there is a lot of content shared online about the grief of getting diagnosed late. And it's always so inspiring to listen to and to read about and to watch. And I don't know, I want to share my story as well, because I think it's so important. And yeah, upon all of that reflection, it's just hard to be talking about the symptoms and behavioral patterns that happened when you were a kid, and to realize how much help and support you needed, and how much help and support that you still need because of these things, and not receiving the help and support you need, whether because of stigma or lack of accessibility, fill in the blank as to the reason why. And I think that's why it was so difficult for me to talk about some of the symptoms in detail, because I'm still dealing with a lot of grief. It's something I did talk about when I first recorded the episode, was when you get diagnosed with something like diabetes, it's a big diagnosis and people take it very seriously. People check in on you. It's just thought of as like this because it is, like, it's a life-altering diagnosis. And that same respect, in a way, isn't given to late diagnosed mental illnesses or developmental disorders when it is also a life-altering diagnosis. It often means intensive therapy, medication, like group therapy, new coping skills. Like, there's a lot that goes into it. And I think that I've even faced some situations, both in my personal life and online, where I've mentioned before, where people are like, why do you still talk about OCD? Like, okay, like, we get it. You got diagnosed with something, like, move on. And there's just so many other things you would never say that about to another person. OCD, getting diagnosed with it changed my life, and it continues to change my life. It's made it so rich, but it's also made it really difficult. Same with ADHD. It's opened up this whole other door for potential neurodivergency in me that I was unaware of. And it's life altering and it's hard. And there's so much grief. Again, like realizing how much support you needed, but also just all of the things that you missed out on in a way because you were undiagnosed. I grew up masking and basically cosplaying as a neurotypical person my entire life until I got diagnosed, even though obviously there was some spilling over of my behavior because it's impossible to change your brain. But if anyone tried to change their brain, it was me. Like every single day I woke up and tried to change my brain and it just wouldn't change. And again, to realize why is so validating, but it's also, there would have been so much freedom for me to exist as me, knowing that I was neurodivergent, I guess. Even if the world isn't built for neurodivergent people, there still is some level of like closure, knowing that just having an answer instead of attaching all of these behavioral patterns to your own self-worth and self-value. And yeah, I think that at least for now, I'm probably going to create a boundary. And I guess I'm talking about it because I want to be held accountable for it to myself on the internet. Like, obviously, one day I want to talk about my symptoms and the behavioral things in detail, but right now I just can't. And that's really hard for me to say, and it's hard for me to accept because I feel such a duty to share. I always have. I feel such a duty to share, but at this moment, I also have a duty to myself to not share. Again, because there's so much grief. There's a lot of grief that I need to heal from, and to let myself experience in light of these diagnoses. And I wanted to just mention that, I guess, because it's so interesting when you position yourself as a mental health advocate because there's such a need for it. There's a need for people to be talking about their symptoms in detail. That's a part of the reason why I got diagnosed, is because people were vulnerable and willing and passionate enough to put their experiences online. And I admire those people so much, and I want to be like them too, because if what I'm doing isn't impacting someone, it's very hard for me to continue on in what I'm doing. And it's interesting though, thinking about how much emphasis I personally put on making an impact for others, like the impact that has on me in my experience. And I think that can even tie into masking as neurotypical, because I had to mask to survive. I had to mask to be sure I wasn't too much for neurotypical people. And now, because I'm finding freedom in taking up space with my brain, not working against it, not suppressing all of my behavioral patterns, because I think if some of you remember, last year I even made a post about stress, and how my psychiatrist basically looked me in the eye and was like, you have to get a hold of your stress. You have chronic stress. And I used to get so annoyed because my whole life people told me, Christina, you're too stressed. Christina, you're too stressed. You need to get a handle on your stress. But no one ever sought to understand why I was so stressed. And being in therapy allowed me to see, my therapist pointed out, you have been suppressing yourself for your whole life. Of course you're stressed. Of course your body is fatigued and sick, because imagine working against your brain 100% of the time. And that really stuck with me. And so in an effort to not work against my brain, putting up this boundary, I think will be helpful for me for now, because it's just hard. It's really hard. And I really would love for anyone who is comfortable in, whether on Instagram or in the comments on YouTube, to just share their own experience with grieving when you receive a late diagnosis of anything, really. I think even if you struggle with a physical chronic illness or something else, I think that core emotion is the same, because it's such a weird tension of, I finally have an answer and this is so exciting, to, I wish I had known this so much sooner. And then the flip side of that, of life was so much, seemingly so much easier before having the answer, because you were living in almost blissful ignorance. You weren't aware of the stress. You just thought it is what it is. Again, it's such a complex, layered experience. And though I'm not ready to talk about specific symptoms in detail, I do think I am ready to talk about the grief of just it's so frustrating because it's underlying in everything I do. Every day. It's so hard. Every day you're still navigating the disorder you've had forever, but you're navigating it and having to create your own map with it. And I just think that that's such a hard, unique experience that I know so many of you have probably gone through as well. And I, again, would love to hear your thoughts. Even for me, I want to feel less alone in experiencing this, because it is very isolating. But I wanted to share a little bit about why I needed to re-record the episode. And I guess I still am kind of talking about what you guys requested, but I think sometimes I got so used to not listening to my body because of how much I was suppressing over the course of my life, that now, since I'm in a healthier place and I can hear my body, I can hear its signals again. So much of the content that I would have been able to talk about and blow through with no reaction, I now react very aggressively almost. My body just communicates so clearly, and I can hear it for the first time of we can't talk about this. Just the alarm bells. And that's a beautiful thing to be connected to, honestly, instead of numbness. But it makes it hard when I want to talk about mental health and ADHD and neurodivergency. And I think that there is a healthy way to do it. I think that there's so many. Morgan Harper Nichols is such an amazing example of this. And I just am inspired by people who can do this without crossing their own boundaries. But you have to have boundaries to begin with, to not cross them. And so I think that I'm publicly talking about how I want to be a little bit more private with some of this, because I think it's necessary, and why it's just so important for me to keep things private. And I don't want to keep it private forever, but yeah, it just like really took me aback that I had such an upsetting reaction to talking about my symptoms. And I'm proud of myself for setting this boundary. And I hope it encourages you to take a step of courage and set a boundary where you need to. And I think that's all I want to talk about for this episode. Super short, a quick little update. And I will see you next week. I hope that you take a couple minutes to breathe and reset again, even if you aren't like fully affected by what I've said. I do think that, yeah, it's important to listen to your body. I talked about things that are heavy, and grief is a universal emotion. So just take care of yourself as you continue throughout your day. And again, I would love to hear from you, whether in the comments on YouTube or at Genuinely Care About You on Instagram. And I will catch up with you guys next week, where I promise we will have a lighter episode. Maybe about Twilight if I finish it. And yeah, I love you guys. Take good care. And I'll see you next week.